And he said the reason why it's important for us to be doing so much field service work is because it helps to keep us productive. Otherwise, we would spend our time doing something that's bad. We'd probably be breaking the law, just doing something that's not good. Field service work was saving us from ourselves. Capitalism, this is a cult where many of you are being forced every day to do useless things with your time. A lot of y'all's jobs are not important, but your time needs to be taken up because this is one big high control situation we're all in, and you're not trusted to use your free will the right way.
Capitalism does not want you to rest. I should know. I've spent the last 6 or 7 weeks feeling guilty for resting. Number one, my nervous system was so fried leading up to this medical leave that I couldn't sleep, and I was suffering from memory lapses. And sometimes I got so anxious, I started shaking. On top of that, someone in the first week of February sliced my body open and removed 2 of my organs and then sewed me back up. So even at least the second thing, I should be entitled to a few weeks for that. And I am, by law. Enormously complicated amount of paperwork it takes for me to justify that both to my employer and to the state. I'm going to read an excerpt from Caliban and the Witch. One of the preconditions for capitalist development was the process that Michael Foucault defined as the disciplining of the body, which in my view consisted of an attempt by state and church to transform the individual's powers into labor power. It was in the 16th century in the areas of Western Europe most affected by the Protestant Reformation and the rise of the mercantile bourgeoisie that we see emerging in every field, the stage, the pulpit, the political, and philosophical imagination, a new concept of the person. It was in an attempt to form a new type of individual that the bourgeoisie engaged in that battle against the body that has become its historic mark. According to Max Weber, the reform of the body is, at its core, of the bourgeois ethic because capitalism makes acquisition the ultimate purpose of life, instead of treating it as a means for the satisfaction of our needs. Thus, it requires that we forfeit all spontaneous enjoyment of life. Capitalism also attempts to overcome our natural state by breaking the barriers of nature and by lengthening the workday beyond the limits of the sun, the seasonal cycles, and the body itself. Marx, too, sees the alienation from the body as a distinguishing trait of the capitalist work relation. By transforming labor into a commodity, capitalism causes workers to submit their activity to an external order over which they have no control and with which they cannot identify. Thus, the labor process becomes a ground of self-estrangement. The worker, quote, only feels himself outside his work, and in his work feels outside himself. He is at home when he is not working, and when he is working, he is not at home. He must constantly look upon his labor power as his own property, his own commodity. So see, it forces us to commodify ourselves. I had to jump in here for a minute because this part is important, because as I was listening to this video, editing it, I realized that that was my mistake with my career. When I started commodifying myself, that's when things started going off the rails. I thought of myself as, what skills that I have will the market pay for at the rate that I need them to pay? I totally removed my own humanity from the equation, and I thought only about market value, what the market value of my skills were. And then I wonder why I wake up 10 years into this career that I didn't choose, that fell into my lap because of various circumstances of my life, married, divorced, relocation to 2 different states. I commodified myself, and I didn't really need much prompting to do that. It's the way we've been conditioned. And being disconnected from your body in that way, I feel like the way that my brain works I'm dissociated. I'm dissociated from my body. And I think that's what's happening. And that actually might be what a midlife crisis actually is, because technically 47, I'm at midlife crisis age. But all this time we thought the midlife crisis was just about, oh, well, you know, men get bored in their marriages and they want to cheat and they get a sports car and women do this and do that. Maybe it's this. Maybe it's your body, your mind finally reacting to 4-5 decades of commodification and disassociation. Curious to know what you guys think about this. Tell me in the comments. This too leads to a sense of dissociation from the body, which becomes reified, reduced to an object with which the person ceases to be immediately identified. Effectively, what that's saying is that in order to survive in a capitalist system, you have to disappear. In 16th and 17th century Europe, they essentially did to workers what Lizzie is describing they did to her as a Jehovah's Witness. Implement all kinds of constraints on their time, schedule them with stuff that kept them occupied so that they wouldn't have any free time. So they wouldn't, sit around and dream because they couldn't be trusted to use their leisure time properly. But it took a long time to do that. It took a long time for the public to accept a wage labor system. First, they tried kicking them off all the public lands, or what they refer to as the liberation of labor power, the expropriation of the peasantry from the common lands, closing off all the commons, and enclosure is what it was called. And they found that that wasn't enough to force them to accept the labor they wanted to. So here's what they did. The expropriated peasants and artisans did not peacefully agree to work for a wage. More often, they became beggars, vagabonds, and criminals. This is their way of life. These people have lived like this for centuries, and you think they're just going to abandon the way that they always lived, sharing lands and resources in common, and then working for wages that they could freely negotiate? Artisans and laborers got together in groups, i.e. unions, and they negotiated collectively for better wages and work conditions. Another part of the system they wanted to break. A long process would be required to produce a disciplined workforce. In the 16th and 17th centuries, the hatred for wage labor was so intense that many proletarians preferred to risk the gallows rather than submit to the new conditions of work. You know what this reminds me of? This reminds me of the time when they were briefly talking about bringing back the draft. And young millennials and Gen Z were like, okay. And like, well, if you don't register and if you are a draft dodger, we'll put you in jail. They were like, cuff me. For all the accusations we levy against them for being lazy and having no guts, I think they have some grit. Those younger people have more grit than I've seen in the last couple of generations. So how did the powers that be respond? Well, let's see. The response of the bourgeoisie was the institution of a true regime of terror, implemented through the intensification of penalties, particularly those punishing the crimes against property. Remind me, every time there's a protest when a citizen is unalived by the police force, usually a citizen who looks a lot like me, what's the first thing they complain about on Fox News? Why are they destroying all the businesses in their own neighborhoods? They're worried more about the property, about property crimes, than they're worried about the person who's no longer living, or the conditions that the people in that community have had to live under. It's always about the property. The introduction of bloody laws against vagabonds intended to bind workers to the jobs imposed on them, as once the serfs had been bound to the land, and the multiplication of executions. So the existence of a poor, underclass, a poor servant class, didn't really change from serfdom to capitalism, except instead of being bound to the land, you were bound to the wage. It's like that saying about Black women, for Black women, slavery never ended, we just changed masters. Our masters went from white men to Black men. But the violence of the ruling class was not confined to the repression of transgressors. It also aimed at a radical transformation of the person, intended to eradicate in the proletariat any form of behavior not conducive to the imposition of a stricter work discipline. It was illegal to play games. They closed taverns and they closed public baths. So first, they enclosed all the lands and kicked the peasants off the common lands, but that wasn't enough. So then they threatened them with jail, execution, and they closed all the third spaces, and they basically made recreation illegal. We've talked a little bit on this app about the disappearance of third spaces and its effect on communities, but we don't have to outlaw games anymore. We don't have to outlaw leisure time, or we didn't even really have to close the third spaces, because now we're at a point where we're so ingrained in this stuff that we shame ourselves and each other for resting. Feel guilty for not being productive every moment of every day. Mission accomplished.